In today's video, we're going to talk about exposure. But before we dive into setting up your exposure, let's first define what video is. In short, video is a sequence of still images called frames. The number displayed per second is known as your frame rate and typically measured in frames per second. For example, if you have your FPS set at 24, means 24 individual frames are taken each second. So when a video is played, it creates the motion of pictures. Exposure consists of three elements: your shutter speed, ISO, and aperture. So while your frame rate captures each individual frame, your shutter speed controls the length of time that a camera shutters open when capturing each frame of the video. And this affects the exposure and the motion of your video. A fast shutter speed will result in a dark image and produce a crisp video with no motion blur. A slow shutter speed will result in a brighter image and creates motion blur. Now your frame rate and shutter speed can be confusing, but what helped me understand between the two, which ties it all in together, and that is doubling your frame rate or the 180-degree shutter rule. When choosing your frame rate at 24 FPS, 30, 60, 120, the rule is that you set your shutter speed double the frame rate. So 24 would be 1 over 48 or 150, 30 FPS would be 1 over 60, 60 would be 1 over 125, 120 would be 1 over 250. Since there are more frames being recorded, this creates a natural motion blur, which allows for a realistic viewing experience. On the left shows double the frame rate, and on the right is not double the frame rate. The left shows a smoother motion blur, while the one with a higher shutter speed doesn't have any motion blur at all. Also, lowering your shutter speed at 1/10 of a second will produce a lot of motion blur. For the second element is your ISO, and this is the sensitivity to light. Low ISO means less sensitivity to light, and a higher ISO means more sensitivity to light. The higher you go, the more grain and loss of quality will show. So I recommend keeping it as low as possible. Here's an example of low ISO versus high ISO. Low ISO shows no grain and quality, while the higher ISO starts to show grain and loss of quality. If you're finding this helpful already, stay until the end of the video because I have a bonus tip for you guys to help you set up your exposure. The third and final element is your aperture or f-stop. And this is the opening of your lens, which allows light to pass through, and the depth of field, which controls how much blurriness or clarity you want in the background. As you can see at 1.4, it gives you a smooth, blurry background and bokeh, while at 16, you can see the background. So definitely play around with your aperture and adjust it accordingly to your project. When I'm shooting, I have my shutter speed set at whatever FPS that may be, and I don't touch it at all. I only adjust the ISO and aperture to make sure I'm exposing properly using the built-in light meter in my camera. Every camera has a built-in light meter, and this basically helps you read your exposure. As you can see here, this is the built-in light meter, and the arrow you see shows your current exposure value. So if the arrow is at -1, it means you're one stop underexposed, and if the arrow is at +1, it means you're one stop overexposed. When the arrow is in the middle or at 0, this shows that you're properly exposed with just the right amount of light to your scene. Now with this camera recording right now, I have my exposure just a little over 1 stop because I'm shooting on a flat picture profile. But don't worry about this yet, we'll go over picture profiles on a separate video. As promised, here's a bonus tip when setting up your exposure. So if you're shooting on a sunny day and you start to find yourself cranking up your aperture but you want the shallow depth of field, well, this right here is a variable ND filter, and this tool has been a game changer. Attaching an ND filter on your lens will help you reduce the amount of light coming through your lens without affecting the colors of the scene. ND filters vary in stops, and the more stops you want just means the more it will reduce light. This is why I like variable NDs, because if you're on a shoot and don't have time to switch to different ND filters, with variable NDs you can just turn it on the go without having to worry about time. This will give you the opportunity to stick to your shutter speed, control your aperture, and a lower ISO. Okay, I hope that wasn't too much information to take in, but just to recap, remember that your shutter speed is the amount of time that each frame is exposed for. Your ISO is the sensitivity to light. Your aperture is the opening of the lens that allows light to pass through and controls your depth of field. Use the built-in light meter in your camera to help you expose your shot properly. Double your frame rate, adjust your ISO and aperture for exposure. That's all for today's video, and the only way you will get better is by going out there and just keep practicing. The best part about being in this field is that there's always something new to learn. So just be patient with yourself and keep going. You only fail when you give up. So trust your own process rather than the destination. Thank you guys for watching. I will see you guys in the next video.